Okay, good evening, everyone. And today I will be reviewing, and I want to begin with a few items. First of all, today you are handing in your logical analysis. So you completed all the analyses. And please remember your commentary on the text will be due next week. Okay, this is what I want you to submit on the 24th. An updated version of your clause analysis of your text. Please not the one I corrected, all right, with my corrections. Clean it up, please, and give me the updated one, all right? Second, the Excel file containing the theme, transitivity, and logical analysis. Okay, so give me the Excel file with the information there. Finally, your commentary on the text. Word documents, 800 words. And I want you to be discussing how the observed patterning of lexicogrammatical choices, how that corresponds with how it fits with the genre of academic writing. Specifically, IELTS task writing. Now, you might say, how do I know what IELTS task writing is? Well, you've been analyzing it, but what will really make your commentary stand out is whether you actually look up to see and find out what are the expectations for that task in the IELTS exam. What do they describe as the way in which you should answer the question? These are the texts that you analyzed are supposed to be model answers. All right, so, but what's behind it? What is the model answer in terms of its architecture, in terms of the texture, the patterning that you observed, and how that fits with what's the expectation in academic writing. Right, so it's not just counting and telling me, oh, there were so many processes, materials, so many relational, I saw a lot of conjunctions, et cetera, et cetera. Not just that, all right? You can submit all of this to me as a soft copy, all right? Send me an email, and with that email should be the updated version of your clause analysis, a Word document 1. The Excel file, which will contain the 3 analyses, second. And third, your commentary, again, as a Word document. So please attach all of these to your email. And when you do so, as I've asked you previously, put at the subject line that this is for LT5456, final assignment, and you're an A. Got that? LT5456, final assignment, and you're an A. And send that to me by the 24th. Yeah, please, by midnight, all right? And you will have completed your last assignment. On your exam, as we had looked at with the case studies and the mock exam, the question that you will be asked in section A is like this. You'll have a text that you will be analyzing, and you will have the analyses attached as appendices. That is no surprise. What I want to go through and mention to you again today is what I highlighted. I talk about the lexicogrammatical features that contribute to the texture and the architecture text. when you look at the text, what is its, I'm not asking you to do a rhetorical structure theory schema. That I'm not asking you to do. But it is that something that you can do to describe what is the overall structure about this text that should be clear to you from the patterning, from the texture, and from the various parts of the text. What is its overall structure? In other words, what makes this text stand out as coherent? How can the reader follow it and understand the coherent structure of the text? That's the architecture. And this will be based on the texture, the patterns that you see emerge. Where do you find certain lexicogrammatical features chosen within the text? All right, I hope that is clear to you. Now, as I mentioned to you previously, let me run through what I will expect you, how I will expect you to answer this section A. How does the text compare with similar text covered in class? What is the register of the text? Describe in terms of field, tenor, and mode. Field, what is it about? Tenor, what is the function of the text? What is its purpose? And this will be largely dependent on who is the target audience. Mode, what is the mode? Is it written? Is it written to be read aloud? Is it written to be spoken? Is it extemporaneous? What is the nature of the mode? What is register? You are describing the context in terms of these three parameters. And these three parameters are something that you should begin by looking at your text. Last time, this will not be in the question. In the previous exam, I did ask the fit context. Remember? You asked what was the fit to context. The fit to context is fitting it with what is expected in that context. What is it? Namely, it is the register. And while that will not be in the question per se, it will not be here. Nonetheless, this is I am expecting of you when you describe a text. You cannot describe it without reference to its context. And when you describe the context, you describe it in terms of field, tenor, and mode. Are there any observable patterns in the analyses? Because you will have them there in the appendix to the exam: transitivity, theme, logical. And how do these contribute to the texture, the cohesiveness, and the architecture, the coherence of the text? What features specifically fit with the register of the text? Given the nature of the text, how do the features that you see there fit with your expectations for a text of this type? Are there deviations from the expectations for this register? We've talked about the anti-text, right? So does the text that you're looking at deviate from what you would expect? This is what you should have in mind as you are going through your analysis. This is what I will look for. All right, now I mentioned this, the key concepts before, and I give you a list, and I will give you the PDF. I didn't want to give you the PDF of this until I finished it, and so I will give it to you later, all right? And you'll see this list. Make sure that this list is something that you know what each of these is referring to. Now, I'll give a rundown through today's class and cover these basic key concepts, all right? Lectures 1 and 2. Systemic functional linguistics. What does it mean, systemic? Systems of choice. Sets of semantic options. Really, SFL, systemic functional linguistics, is a theory of meaning, because that's what you begin with. These semantic options, these choices, correspond to the meaning potential text. And what is meaning? Ideation, interpersonal, textual. Ideational meaning has two subcomponents. One is the experiential, which we see in the system of transitivity, and also the logical. Both of these within the ideational function, meta function. We have the interpersonal, enacting interpersonal relations. We have the textual, how that meaning actually becomes concretely realized within the text. So then what is the system of transitivity? Process, participant, circumstance. And processes are differentiated into different types. How do we differentiate these processes? Not just on the basis of meaning. We differentiate them grammatically, how they behave. And how they behave, we have three tests that tell us. One is, can you ask, what did X do? What did X do to Y? Can you ask that question for that process? Mental processes, you can. Material processes, you can. Must the initiator be human-like or have a sense of consciousness? Mental processes, you must. Can the process project? Can it take a that clause? Some of you, when you were analyzing in terms of your transitivity, you would identify something as being a material process, but then it would take a that clause, which then obviously it's not a material process. The process types have different roles, and we've broken these down into the ER roles and the ED roles. So what is a language? A language is a semiotic system. It is a system of meaning. Are there other semiotic systems? Yes. The traffic lights that you see. Red means stop, green means go. That's a semiotic system. The clothing that you wear is a semiotic system. It
Attention,
is
please.
useful.
The fire alarm system has been
How you
activated.
want to be identified.
We are investigating the situation.
All these are related.
Please remain calm and pay attention to further announcements. Thank you.
You hear something?
請注意，
What is it?
火警警報系統現已啟動，工作人員正在調查中。請大家保持冷靜並留意廣播。多謝。
Do I need to stop?
請注意，火警警報系統現
I
已
hear that.
工作人員正在調查中，請大家保持冷靜並留意廣播。謝謝。
Attention, please. The fire alarm system has been activated. We are investigating the situation. Please remain calm and pay attention to further announcements. Thank you.
請注意，火警警報系統現已啟動，工作人員正在調查中。請大家保持冷靜並留意廣播。多謝。請注意，火警警報系統現已啟動，工作人員正在調查
How
中。
does it do so?
請大家保持冷靜並留意廣
The
播。
choices that you make realize the meaning that you want to convey. This system of
Attention,
choice
please.
is
The fire
represented
alarm
by
system has
nowadays
been activated.
a system
We are
network
investigating
calls
the
it.
situation.
Choices
remain
that are
calm.
and
Pay
choices and
attention to
or
further
choices.
Thank you.
And, for example, you have choice of
火警
process
警
type.
報系統現已啟
You
動，
have a choice of
工作
food
人員
type. Will
正
it
在
be
調查中，
a question or will it be
請大家保持
inherited
冷
or
靜
a declarative?
並留意廣播。
You have a choice of theme. All three choices
請注
are
意，
being made
火警警報系統現已
simultaneously,
啟動，
concurrently.
工作人員正
At
在
the
調
same
查
time, you
中，
have or choices.
請大家保
So
持
these are and these are or. You have a material or mental or verbal or relational. So what is meaning making
Attention, please. The
It is
fire
carried
alarm
out by a
system has been
system
activated.
of
We are
choices?
investigating
And
the
these
situation.
choices are and
Please remain calm
choices and
and pay
or
attention to further
choices.
announcements. Thank you.
請注
Halliday
意，
said this,
火警警報系統
explaining the
已啟
inspiration
動，
behind
工作人員
representing the
正
whole
在
thing
調查
like
中，
this as a set of
請
options.
大家保持冷靜
Halliday said this.
並留意廣
This was
播。
certainly influenced by my own gut feeling of what I call language as a resource.
火警警報系統現已啟動，
Language was a mode of life.
工作人員正在
It
調
was to be
查中，
represented best as a huge
請大
network
家
of
保持
options.
冷靜。
So that kind of came together with the notion that it had to be a system rather than a structure. It was given priority.
Attention, please. The fire alarm system has been activated. We are investigating.
I've already
the
mentioned
situation.
about this before.
Please
I'm
remain calm.
interested here to
Pay
mention
attention to further announcements.
specifically the inspiration behind the functional
請注
part.
意，
And the
火警
functional
警報
comes
系統
from
現已
this
啟動，
broad
工
school,
作人員
this
正
approach
在
to
調查中，
language.
請大家保持冷
It
靜。
began with Carl Mueller. He put forward these three functions: the expressive, the cognitive, the representation.
火警警報系統現已啟動，
Halliday, when
工
he
作人
began,
員正在調查中，
when he was formulating his theory, he did not talk about the meta function.
並留意廣播。
That comes later. To begin with, he's just talking about the uses of
Attention,
language
please. The fire alarm system.
a
has been
child
activated.
would use
We are investigating the
in terms
situation.
of being able to
Please
communicate.
remain calm and pay attention.
And he identifies this list of what he calls the micro functions,
請注意，火警警報
the
系統現
instrumental
已
function,
啟動，
language to fulfill a
工作
need,
人員
the
正在調
regulatory
查中，
function, language
請大
influence
家
the
保持
behavior of
冷
others.
靜。
So Halliday begins with these micro
多
functions,
謝。請注意，
or the infant or the child is a child growing up. This can be
工作人
communicated
員
by
正在
gesture,
調
it
查
can
中，
be indicated by
請大
vocal
家保
sounds.
持冷靜，並留意
But
廣
then
播。
Halliday
謝謝。
went a further step and generalized these micro functions into what he calls the macro functions: demanding and describing. Now, for example, under pragmatic would be the regulatory, the instrumental. These are the micro functions we just noticed. Under the methodic would be the interactional, the personal, the describing what is, the demanding what should be. The regulatory, the instrumental, the micro functions. Identified and now generalized within demanding. The interactional, the personal, under describing, the methodic. On what basis did he do this generalization? Why did he go from micro functions to macro functions? The point being that for these functions, these micro functions that are what he identified as methodic, describing, they had a particular intonation, a particular tone pattern. For those that are pragmatic, demanding, they had a different intonation. So he identified then two categories based on the difference in terms of the intonation that was used. Again, we're looking at the grammar as a basis. But by grammar, I'm including not just what the syntax, but also the phonology, the intonation. And on this basis, he identified these two macro functions. So we have a distinction between the grammar on the one hand and meaning on the other, and a connection that is formed between them. So that certain meanings have a certain realization grammatically. In this case, a certain intonation. Halliday goes on then to further formulate his theory in terms of the pragmatic being the interpersonal, the methetic being the experiential, how we construe experience. And he added to this the logical, this idea of relations between causes and so forth. What he was developing was basically a theory of the metafunctional approach to the study of language. To me, it's quite interesting how that developed. Sometimes when one looks at the theory, one thinks that's where it started. But in fact, it started with earlier ideas that are then later developed, the microfunctions into the macrofunctions, into the metafunctions. He added a third function that was not there in earlier Prague School lists of functions. That was the textual function. This was important because it was the way in which we are able to, in the text, formulate a metaphor, a way of describing the world, our understanding of the world, our theories of the world. The text itself takes on this metaphorical function. We tell our stories. We theorize our world by means of the metaphor-making potential of text. I mention this because I really think what he describes, Russell Mears, this emeritus professor of psychiatry, when he says it's like a metaphor cinematic screen on which is portrayed a partially glimpsed personal reality. What we understand of the world is really just a partially glimpsed vision of it. And then we try to encapsulate that within our texts. So what we are doing is we are projecting through the text our ideas about what is going on in the world and how we relate to one another. My sense of reality around inside me is captured metaphorically and projected verbally through the text. You see, there is no, when you are expressing something, you're only expressing your view of it, your understanding of it. Your reality may be different than my reality. And so each of us have a sort of metaphoric view of the world. Every theory is a metaphor for what it is theorizing. And this ability to metaphorize, to articulate symbols, to theorize, to be poetic, this is what sets us apart from other species. This is what makes language human. Textual. What is a text? Text is meaning. A text is a choice. Choices. That is so much a part of this whole approach to the study of language. What are the choices that you're making? A text is a semantic structure that is formed out of a continuous process of choice among innumerable interrelated sets of semantic options. One choice within the textual metafunction is the choice of theme. We now know what that is. It is the starting point of the message. It is what the text is about. And it's the initial grammatical element. What is the initial grammatical element? What is a grammatical element? It's not the word, right? When we look at theme, what did we identify as theme? Usually it's the grammatical subject, which can be made up of a noun phrase and which can even have an embedded clause in it. Even an embedded clause can be the grammatical subject. It is an experiential element. The focus, identifiable by tone. So we've identified theme, new information. And we see that this can be, what occurs at the beginning can be textual, but it can be vocative, it can be interpersonal, married, it can be grammatical subject, ideation. The choice of theme as it proceeds through the text. What is the thematic progression? Is it linear, where how you end on one sentence to focus, the new information becomes the old information, and how you begin the next clause? Or is it continuous? You keep repeating the same thing as theme. Textual also looks at the taxis relations, hypotaxis, parataxis. This is textual, but at the same time, it is also logical. We see some overlap here. When we talk about parataxis, hypotaxis, logical relations, it is both part of the ideational metafunction and the textual metafunction. Logical meaning, whether it is elaborating, extending, enhancing, projecting, can be paratactic or it could be hypotactic. We've looked at examples such as Obama's use of a pattern, very symmetrical, paratactic, followed by paratactic, followed by paratactic, and then on top of that, another 3 paratactic relations. The paratactic relations themselves are what moves the text along. We see that in the other speech that Obama gave, in which in fact, as we said, was set to music. Because in this case, we have the as we take, as we learn, that the struggles, that the hopes, again, it has that the pairs of constructions that are placed symmetrically. We will remember, we will begin. This repetition of patterns. Now, this is something that adds to the textual structure that we see here. And that textual structure we can see is very symmetrical, which in many cases adds to how we see it as being sort of having a flow through the text. When we looked at the text from Nixon and Obama, when we looked at Obama's inaugural address, one thing that we noticed here was that when we look at these, the second inaugural, the Yes We Cans, the inaugural, these are what? These are texts that were written to be spoken. They're speeches. And what did we observe in these speeches? Nixon's second inaugural, 28% paratactic, 72% hypotactic. These are well-developed ideas with a logical order that we see an emphasis of the hypotactic compared to the paratactic. But in this one instance, Obama was almost 50-50, paratactic, hypotactic. It deviated It deviated from the expectation. And that deviation prompted people to feel that it was more paratactic than hypotactic, incantatory rather than progressive. The power is in discrete moments rather than in a thesis proved by the marshalling of evidence. It was criticized. And it was criticized because it did not fit the expectation. Instead, his inaugural address, as we saw, would have a whole chunk of several paragraphs, all with the same sort of pattern. The next would have a different pattern. And the next would have a different pattern. So that it had this very loose structure, this very paratactic structure. Which when we analyzed it, we could see that what comes across as a developing text is considered dynamic, it's considered passionate. But if it's very paratactic,
we have investigated the situation and confirmed that this was a false alarm. We regret any inconvenience
false
caused.
alarm.
Thank
Don't
you.
worry. Flat.
請注意，
diffuse.
事故經調查後證實為警鐘誤鳴，不便之處敬請原諒，多謝。
What was interesting for this was to see that
事故經調查後，
people
證
respond
實為警鐘誤鳴，不便之
to
處
the impact
敬請原諒。
of what
谢谢。
people expect in a text. And a deviation from that prompts people to have a very different reaction. So Nixon's second inaugural, 28% paratactic, 72% hypotactic. Very well structured. It had linear thematic progression. It had continuous thematic progression. I'm sorry, I should have pointed the pointer at the screen back there. It had linear thematic progression. It had continuous thematic progression. It had the use of conjunctions. All of these textual devices to give a coherent patterning to the text. You could see the architecture of the text. What contributes to the architecture? Thematic progression. Theme relates to the method of development of the text. The other interesting thing about that inaugural, as I pointed out, was there's a pattern of let us throughout the text. But what was really interesting was when it deviates from that. Why that chunk of text? Why these several paragraphs, paragraphs 3 through 11, when he's talking about peace? Why? No, let us. But it's otherwise here throughout the text. Well, that is something you would notice and that you would remark on. Because it suggests something. It suggests that perhaps this part of the text doesn't quite fit with the rest of it. Systems of mood and modality, interpersonal meaning. Mood relates to whether or not you are making a statement, whether you're making a question, whether you're offering, whether you're making a request. Why is this related to interpersonal? Because it's to do with the exchange of meaning. Am I asking something of you, or am I going to give you something? And is that something information? I make a statement. I give you information. I ask a question. I want to be given information. I want to receive it. Or am I offering you something? Goods and services is how we put it. What else comes under interpersonal? Modality. Again, going back to Nixon and looking at his resignation speech. What interested us here was the use of the modal auxiliaries. Okay. You don't ignore that. That's part of the interpersonal meaning. And the use of those modal auxiliaries, for example, the shall, comes at pivotal moments when the text takes a turn. In other words, what's the architecture of this text? It is signaled by the modal auxiliary shall. When he uses that, he is identifying that this is a change in the text itself. You talk about the architecture. You're looking at a change that occurs, perhaps the use of a particular modal auxiliary. In this speech, what was also quite interesting was whereas the most of the speech has the first person, there was one part that has first person plural, not first person singular. Well, that was interesting because that part of the text seemed to be going back. He's here resigning as president, but he's going back into that mode of being president when it's about we, the nation. You're looking at these patterns. This is a texture. These particular paragraphs and so forth that we see here, they have a particular texture. The texture is the pattern. And what do you mean by the patterning? It can be the use of first person singular or first person plural like this. It can be the use of a particular modal auxiliary. Nixon's other speech that we looked at was the speech that he gave. It was extemporaneous. It was spontaneous. It wasn't written out. And that was so obvious from the nature of the text, which, as we can see, was largely paratactic, much less hypotactic. Difference between speaking and writing. What have we observed? The logical relations, parataxis, hypotaxis, plays an important part in distinguishing speech, extemporaneous speech, and written language, even when it is written to be spoken. The use of conjunctions and, but repeatedly throughout the text indicate that paratactic. It is why? Because you don't have time to really develop your ideas. Instead, your ideas just go one after the other. Lectures 3 and 4. What's cohesiveness? Cohesiveness is what we've defined as the texture. What is cohesion? Cohesion is where there is one element that is dependent for its interpretation on another element within the text. 5 types of cohesion. Reference, the use of pronouns. Substitution, the use of the verb do instead of another verb. Ellipsis, leaving something out because you perhaps already said it. The use of conjunction, the use of lexical cohesion. This can be reiteration in the sense of repeating. It can be synonymy, words that mean similar things, opposites, antonyms. What's the difference between cohesion and coherence? Coherence is the extent to which each element or part may be understood as contributing to the overall meaning of the text as a whole. When we looked at Trump's speaking and we're talking about whether or not he sounds presidential, what does that mean? We looked at two examples. The one example was his speech before Congress, and we saw many of the features like we see in other speeches like Nixon and Obama. Repetition of things in threes, a thematic progression, linear thematic progression, repetition of the same thing. And we come back and we see that there is also largely hypotactic as opposed to correct. But then when he gives this speech at the CIA headquarters, it is obviously not written. It's obviously him just talking. And again, we see that there's a difference in terms of it's far more paratactic. Another thing that was noticeable about Trump's speech is how first person it is. We noticed that, in fact, in the speech to the CIA, it was first person singular 14%, first person plural 7%. It was largely largely talking about himself. And when we looked at it, we were interested to see what was the I, first person singular, doing. It was largely what he thought and what he said. But the speech that he gave to Congress was largely about we and what we are doing. Very different in terms of what we observe about the nature of the text. Not just parataxis and hypotaxis, but the first person references something. In a speech that is given to a major political speech, is it going to be largely first person? No. It would be, that's unexpected, but that's exactly what Trump was doing when he gave that speech to the CIA headquarters. So how do people react when there is a deviation? When it deviates from what people expect, people react negatively. Oh, he is a man with scattered thoughts, a short attention span, lack of intellectual discipline and analytical skills. People judge on the basis of whether or not the text meets their expectations. In fact, this linguist doubts whether Trump can even use hypotaxis. But in fact, yes, he can, as we've seen in the speech to Congress. So we notice Nixon's departure speech, largely spontaneous. Trump's speech to the CIA, largely spontaneous, except Reagan's speech. And what happens? We notice that it very much has an impact. It is realizing a very different logical structure. Shift our attention. What is metaphor? We've talked about lexical metaphor, and that's usually what we think of. But we have introduced a new idea, and that is grammatical metaphor. And what is grammatical metaphor? The idea that language is stratified. You have meaning, you have grammar, wording, and they are connected. And this connection is sort of by default. Processes are represented by verbs, things by nouns, relators by conjunctions. But then, this is the literal, this is the congruent. We now can shift that, and that change is grammatical metaphor. we can take a process and we can turn it into a noun, and it takes on qualities of thingness. We looked at that as an example in a speech that was given by Donald Trump. And the point that was made was, he says, at one level you can read that, and at another level it is a reminder. But when he says it is a reminder, why does he not say it reminds us? Because what he did was he took a verb that means something mental, and he turned it into a thing. And it takes on a substance. It takes on a quality that a verb doesn't have. It takes on the quality of nounness. It is a grammatical metaphor. Grammatical metaphor becomes a means to innovate in language at the level of structure, just like traditional metaphor is at the level of words. But there's a third. And what is the third? We've had lexical, we had grammatical, and we had an extended metaphor. Metaphorical meaning is created through a patterning that creates a background, the automatic, and then repatterning against this background, foregrounding as a kind of deautomatization that extends across the text. Taking away that we normally use language, mobilizing the habitual patterns of language choice, as Professor David Buck says, and doing what? Creating a background specific to that text. It is taking the way we use language and creating a pattern within the text, which then the writer, the poet, breaks that pattern, creates a different pattern that goes against the pattern that was created in the text. Foregrounding is a kind of deautomatization that extends across the text. Do you remember that we looked at the murder on the Orient Express? And when we looked at it, we were interested to look at the conversation that took place. And it was the director and the script writer were very mindful of what they were doing in creating the text that goes with this. Michael Green, the screenwriter, wrote this. He says, together we would be thinking not only of how it would be shot, but how he would want to play individual moments. We could look at a line, discuss the tone, the camera angles, but also I could hear him read it directly to me, and I would be able to shape the lines instantly for him. Shaping the text, it is creating the text. And you remember that there was this part toward the end of the movie where he talks about we keep seeing this existential there being repeated. There are two people. There are two possible solutions. There is a murderer among us. There was right, there was wrong. Now there is you. This use of the existential there is not common, especially repeated. But what they were doing was they were taking the way we use language, we use the existential, and they were creating a pattern in which it was being repeated, in which it was there is, but then there was. Well, that was the first change. That was the first foreground. Changing the tense. It is no longer there. It no longer exists. It has changed. And that is definitely what we would call foregrounding. You create an automatic of there is, there are. But then there was a second foreground. There is you. And from then on, you. A new pattern. They are deliberately taking the way we use language and repeating it, their choices, so that it creates an obvious pattern, which then, in the case of changing from the existential there is to you, or there are, the present tense to the past tense. All of this to give it a particular meaning. It was moving from the very rational to the almost irrational, from the very ideational to the interpersonal. Instead of there is, there are, now there is you, and then everything is you. We looked at commencement speeches. David Foster Wallace. His way of speaking is usually very dense, his writing. And so it was sort of remarkable when we'd see this is not a matter of virtue. We'd see throughout the text these simple clauses as sentences, then followed by very lengthy, complex clauses. The point of his speech, it was a commencement speech. What do we know about commencement speeches? We've looked at Steve Jobs, we looked at Susan Rice, we looked at David Foster Wallace. What was different about his? Why is it an anti-commencement speech? Well, in his words, and I didn't put it here, but in his words, it wasn't just a nice motivational speech. It had a meaning. And that meaning was to go against your default self-centeredness. It wasn't like his usual style. In other words, the whole speech was a metaphoric variant. It was the counter reality to what a normal commencement speech would be like. Because he was trying to make the point that we need to move away from what we normally recognize as the default. When what is so automatic that we don't recognize. The key to creativity in verbal art, our ability to create the automatic, this is water. It is against that to which we de-automatize. Lectures 5 and 6. Coherence, the architecture. And we looked at that in terms of rhetorical structure theory. That a text has a particular rhetorical structure that is hierarchical, smaller into larger, where each part is related to another part. We have the relations defined in rhetorical structure theory, and we can see that hierarchical structure in the example that I'm showing here. And we then demonstrated how you could show this in a rhetorical structure schema, where the first paragraph, I found Megan's column informative and topical. A few aspects troubled me. And what were they? Well, paragraph 2, 3, and 4, which we call the satellites. And the main idea being the nucleus. The few aspects troubled me. The relations in rhetorical structure theory, how are they defined? They are not defined grammatically. They are defined in terms of the effect, what effect it has on the reader, defined in terms of basically the semantics. When we define concession, The writer has positive regard. That is not grammatical. That is semantic. It's how one responds to it. That is meaning. Meaning is response. Meaning is how one responds to something. And so we looked at it in terms of this letter. This is a CPG letter. We observed how, for example, clause 11, 12, and 13. What are they? 11, 12, and 13. They are a functionally significant span text. How do you know? Because they have a continuous thematic progression. They have a unity. And that unity is that repeating the same thing as theme. A continuous thematic progression is one aspect of what we define as a functionally significant span text. That span of text would be related to what follows. And how would it be related? Well, it is signaled, but we urgently need your help. Your support now is critical. And sandwiched in between that was the reason why they need your help. Because they're being swamped. They're being overwhelmed. And that, as we identified, was the main thrust, the motivation, why you should give money. They need it. When we create this schema, what we're doing by identifying the nucleus and the satellites is identifying the core elements within the text. One thing I'd like to point out, Matt, is that when we talk about a rhetorical structure theory, look at the definitions of the relations. We say that they are semantic. We say that they are not grammatical. But I would caution against concerns that maybe that is then too subjective if it is just semantic. And a point that I tried to make repeatedly was that when we look at an example like this, there is motivation. How do you know it's motivation? It is an imperative. If there's going to be a motivation, there must be a doing, something that has to be done that you're motivating. There should be an imperative. How do you know its purpose? Well, to show. The to infinitive form of the verb. How do you know it's concession? Well, the conjunction but. How did you know it was condition? The conjunction if. You have elaboration. You have concession. Again, the conjunction but. And then you have a sequence. Today, by a week from today. This putting as theme what? You're putting as theme time, reference to time. It indicates a sequence. The point I was making is that the rhetorical structure is not just an interpretation. It is not just a subjective interpretation. It is very much signaled by the grammar. We looked at this example in this email, and we looked at the difference between, now this is why we say that it is semantic rather than just syntactic. If I was just examining this on grammatical grounds, and I compared we can, one, blah, 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 or we can, blah, 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 and we can see that they are in contrast. They're different. They're alternatives. We can or we can. We can or we can. Grammatically, I'd say that they are largely joint, contrast, because of what is signaled. But when you read it, you realize that one is favored over the other. That's why rhetorical structure theory is semantic, not just grammatical. It does look at what the text is saying. So in fact, it is a relation not of contrast, but of antithesis, where you, yes, have a contrast, but one side is favored over the other. Now that is the nature of the text. We looked at one of the speeches of Hu Jintao. Again, the signals are there throughout the text. We have the first person, which is mentioned at the beginning. We have the let us, which is at the end. But this was the striking part. We should, our cooperation as partners. And then it carries on in all of the subsequent paragraphs. Our cooperation as partners should be based. Our cooperation as partners should be based. There is a continuous thematic progression. First begins with this is, we should, our cooperation as partners. That is the focus of the first paragraph here. And then it is carried on and developed here. It is a combination of linear and continuous thematic progression. Looking at theme is an important aspect of understanding how the text is coherently structured. Again, in this speech that he was giving, it begins with the very first person. It ends with the very first person. Time as a circumstance allows the speech to progress through a time sequence and highlights that by putting it as theme. This is the architecture. The architecture is very much related to the choices of theme. There was another thing that I pointed out, and that was that when you do have something like today, then what do you expect to be the tense? In a paragraph that begins with today, you would expect it to be present tense, right? Are confronted, has added. Now, I'd like. So, but when it shifts in recent years, well, then it would be the present perfect. When you signal what is the time with that circumstances theme, it will then define what will be the tense, which will have to coincide with what you've identified as the time. In other words, the patterning of tense here follows the pattern of what we identified as theme. Steve Jobs. Repetition of things in threes. Very typical. We see it a lot in Obama. You see it here. It's a rhetorical device. Things that are opposite, dropping in, dropping out, looking in, looking forward, looking backwards, the heaviness, the lightness. These contrasts juxtaposed next to each other. Yes, his speech is also very much first person. But you would expect that in a commencement speech. Because a commencement speech is largely one's personal story that is being used to motivate the listeners. But what we noticed was that in these stories, which went from I being used 33%, and gradually reducing. The second story being about losing his job. The third story being about facing death. He becomes less and less the doer, as he no longer is the initiator. What is taking place? I talked about that court case. In looking at that court case, we were interested in the trial judge's summation of evidence and the fit to context. And I asked the question, what happens when the text does not meet the demands of the context? I was asked specifically to address the speed of delivery. And I did that. I analyzed the text in terms of the various parts of it. Was specifically the summation of evidence, you remember, that the judge gave at the end. And the summation of evidence typically has certain parts to it. The opening, the directing on some important principles of law, directions of law, elements of the offense, and then the summary of the evidence. I looked at and counted the words per minute. But the real question was not just to look at the speed, which gradually we noticed got faster and faster, but asking this question: how does the judge's speed of delivery compare with a normal speaking rate for this situation? See, I was asked just to look at the speed. But you cannot just look at the speed by itself. You have to look at it in the context of other expectations for what would be occurring in this situation. Is he talking faster than usual? Remember, court proceedings include a whole range of different, we could call them even registers. There is some extemporaneous speech, for example, when someone is a witness and they are asked a question and they respond. It isn't written to be spoken. There is a range of possibilities, but in this case, what was the judge doing? He was reading from prepared text. He was reading something that had been written to be spoken. In a court, what would be the expectation? Well, we saw that based on certain examples from other cases, other places, 150 to 160 words per minute. In terms of a certification exam, 140 words per minute. Then we saw that he reached even 200 words per minute within a particular 6-minute section. Within that 6 minutes, he's talking about, if you remember, this was the judge was talking about the evidence that was given by the defense's own expert witness. That part of the evidence that would be favorable and it's at that point the judge speaks up. To a point that it would almost be, we said, to be considered 40 times faster than normal translating work. 40 times faster, the expectation for the interpreter in this case. Impossible, basically, to do it throughout a long text, which is more than an hour long. But it wasn't just speed of delivery. You have to look also at grammatical complexity. And what's been noted before about the grammatical complexity of what takes place in a court, Charles and Charles talk about use of passive in subordinate clauses. combination of many clauses in one sentence, with deletion, omitting the relative pronoun, and sure enough, we see it in the judge's use of language. All those factors that contribute to the complexity of the text. Lexical density. Another aspect of when you are talking extemporaneous speech, 2 to 3 words, 4 to 6 words in a written text. Halliday notes that in a scientific text, it can reach as high as 13, but then become difficult to comprehend. But as we noted in this case, the judge in his summation of evidence got to even as far as 15 words in a single clause. What was it that we noted? High information load, lexical density, grammatical complexity. And because the judge was reading something that he had written out before, he spoke faster. These are all characteristics that show the difference between written and spoken. Lectures 7 and 8. View, tenor, and mode. Hopefully this is very well understood. Defines the register. Meaning word choice is activated by context of situation form, an instance of some registral variety. It's a register whose correlate is some specific category of context. A good definition of what is a register. Scientific text, a register. And what do we observe within this register of scientific writing? Grammatical metaphor. Taking a happening and turning it into a something. Halliday, in his review of sort of the history of scientific writing, goes back to Newton and finds in Newton's own writing a particular pattern. A causes X. A proves Y. He calls this the most highly valued model for scientific writing. It's the same thing we see in this sentence here. The education of girls preceded the acquisition of the vote by women. The education of girls, A, preceded the acquisition of the vote by women, X. What is doing the job of relating? Process. It isn't conjunctions. It isn't a conjunction relating to clauses. Instead, it is two long, extended noun phrases related by a verb, which shows the relation between them. And so what we see in grammatical text, what we see in scientific text is verbs and adjectives becoming nouns, conjunctions becoming verbs, clauses, simple clauses coming from clause complexes. So instead of they educated girls, a clause related by a conjunction and another clause, we have a nominal group, a noun phrase related by a verb preceded. This is the language of academic writing. It's the language of scientific writing. It has become so common and used so frequently. The instances, the use of language has become the system of language. It has become a variety. It has become a register. And what this has done is it has created a discourse that revolves around things. Things have been foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, and relations. Indeed, the language is shaping us. And when we say this is the language of scientific writing, it's the language of academic writing. No matter what science, not necessarily the hard sciences. This can be the soft sciences as well. Creates a universe of things bounded, stable, determinate, and in place of processes of relations between the things. Interpersonally, it sets itself apart as a discourse of the expert, readily becoming a language of power and technocratic control. What's Halliday mean by that? What he means by that is that in order to be able to be part of this educated elite, you need to be able to have mastered the register. It has set itself up as the language of power and technocratic control. If you are going to succeed, and today, you know full well, it's not just in writing for an academic text. It's going into business, writing a report for your business, whether it's marketing or whatever it is. This is the way you write. It has not only, it perhaps started with scientists like Newton, but it has become the dominant way of writing that shows that one is what? Educated. Verbal art. The idea being that there is a second order of meaning. Another meaning, other than the literal meaning that one can see from what's there in the poem or what's there in the novel. There's another meaning. And this is created by symbolic articulation. Okay, that's a very good expression of nominal, shows nominalization, right? What are you actually saying? How you articulate symbols. How you articulate a metaphor. And how do you do it? By mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice in a non-habitual consistency. Whether it was the there are, there is, there are in Murder on the Orient Express. Creating a background against which to foreground. Deviating from that pattern that's been created. And the whole purpose of it is to create some meaning. Hassan puts it like this, a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. Halliday doesn't really like to use the word foreground. He likes the word deautomatization. Because it has sort of a wider significance. When we talk about grammatical metaphor, we're saying that it is deautomatization. When we talk about foregrounding, it is also deautomatization. It is also finding an automatic, a default, and going against it. Artistically creating an automatization against which to deautomatize. Creating a pattern in order to break the pattern. And it isn't just finding a single instance of contrast. The example that I gave you was the widower in the countryside, in the country by Les Murray. Largely material doing. Largely by the widower. So where's the foreground? Any other process type? Any other participant? repetition of the conjunction and. A background of simple parataxis, in contrast with complex clauses that include parataxis, hypotaxis, and embedding, all in the same sentence. The tense, largely future, I'll do this, I'll do that, in contrast with the other tenses. The widower is typically theme throughout the poem. What I've highlighted in yellow, these would all be the background against which there is foregrounding. But then there is a consistency, and that was where it really gets interesting. Where the contrast that we see, whether it's logical or process type or theme, where it all coincides. Where there's a contrast at all three, and where there is, we notice that it drew our attention to the pain that widower is suffering, screaming, the water closing, smeared on the dark of my thoughts, the darkness, the aching. And that's where the writer was drawing your attention out of a poem that seemed just so boring, and this widower, what he'll do on a daily basis. But then draw your attention to pain that widower felt. We looked at several poems by Edwin Tumble. One of them, Gods Can Die. There is a background of symmetry, duality, major, minor, private, public, throughout the poem. There's a sense of good and bad, dark and light, life and death. But then against that background, he foregrounds hypotaxis. Against that parataxis. And so we see a pattern of parataxis, layer upon layer. And then when he wanted to draw your attention to what had become of his friend, the betrayal by his friend, there was hypotaxis. The duality apparent in this text's personality apparently reflects the poet's feelings about his friend's personality, which is two-faced, hypocritical. And the poet's frustration and disdain for what power has done to their relationship is made particularly evident through the foregrounding of elements that disturb that otherwise balanced state. In a poem reading, we see a motif of ongoing activity, all these verbs in ing. This is mobilizing the habitual pattern of language use into a non-habitual consistency, into a consistency which we notice. The conjunction as repeated so many times, that simultaneity, the sense of incompleteness, the sense of timelessness, all of these motifs realized throughout the poem. In last week when we did the mock test, I asked you to take a look at this rubric. It was used to guide tutors into how to assess students' right, what they should look for. And why this rubric is so useful is because it shows what we should be looking for in an academic writing text. You know, it wouldn't hurt for you to make use of this when you look at your own analysis of that text that you just completed. And because that's academic writing. To what extent does it meet the expectations that are underlined here? We said it's a 3x3 matrix, identifying the genre, the register, the semantics, the meaning, and the grammar, how it's realized. And all of this is related then to the meta functions. And so that last column is quite necessary to look at in terms of when you are looking at ideational meaning and how that is realized lexicogrammatically. These should be aspects that you look at and think about, consider. Textual meaning, realized grammatically through choices of theme selection, through grammatical metaphor, the use of active and passive voice. I would certainly use this as a way to sort of give me some ideas of what to look for in an academic text. Interpersonal meaning. It is clear that there is a need for it. Not, I think you should. How sources are cited and referred to. Lectures 10 and 11, the healing power of language. We looked at Billy Graham's address. We noted the very strong interpersonal quality, especially one of the paragraphs where he poses questions. He uses modality, perhaps, I want to assure you, the use of first person, plural, we, our, all of these to connect with his audience. That defined a whole section of his text. He also very clearly laid out first, secondly, finally, that sort of paratactic structuring, the sequence. Then one of the things I noted, which I told you about, was the use, for example, in this paragraph 11 of all past tense. And then when he moves on to the next paragraph where it starts, but now, present tense, but also present tense. And then will, future tense. The text itself proceeded, past, present, future. All driven by the use of tense. Looked at the poems of Bonhoeffer. His poem, The Past. He writes this dialogue with the past, the attempt to hold on to it, and above all, the fear of losing it. It's the almost daily accompaniment of my life here in prison. And sometimes, especially after brief visits, which are always followed by long partings, it becomes a theme of variations. Text, the poem, is very emotional. The poetry is very sort of unregulated. It reflects the mental state that he was in. He was disturbed. And that was reflected in a poetry, in a poetic form. It was likewise disturbed. But then in the last, it ends with a rhyming scheme, lines that fall through, though of irregular length, into a recognizable feet, concludes with a rhyming couplet in pentameters. The traditional cadence recognized throughout European literature is bringing finality and conclusion. It ends, though, in a poetic form that is regulated, is controlled. He has controlled his emotions. We looked at the example of Brandon Lee. This one really had a very clear architecture. And it was so obvious because it was broken up into letters, the 4 letters. And so it was easy to sort of take them apart and look at it and consider for those letters. For example, I was interested in the use of parataxis and hypotaxis. I noticed that it was supposed to be written in the first letter when he was very young and proceeded as he got older. And you could see that maturity come through in the language as well. You notice the repetition, I'm tired of, I'm tired of, I'm tired of, I'm tired of, I'm tired of. Well, obviously that's a pattern that one could not ignore. And we see, I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you. We compared that with another of his spoken performances. This was his first. And we noticed that the beginning of this particular poem begins with basically simple clauses. And then we have a turning point, which is signaled by but. And the whole sense of how it is expressed. We see a shift from active to passive voice. We see the greater clausal complexity, a sharp peak in lexical density. And we compared it in terms of all of these. And what did we find? That here, when we got to 13, paragraph 13, clause 13, sorry. Clause 13, not paragraphs, clauses. There is no rhyme. It's complex clauses, it's hypotactic, and it's spoken fast. Foregrounding was here. He's drawing your attention. My closing thoughts. What I hope from this course is that there is an appreciation, the power of language for artistic creativity, the scientific technological innovation, this ability to metaphorize, recognizing how language is shaped by, it shapes the context in which it occurs. See, it's not just one way. It's not just that the context shapes the way we speak. It is on the basis of the way we speak that we judge what is the context, the nature of that context. We shape it. It is both ways. It is reciprocal. The relationship between the text and the context. I hope you discovered the wide range of lexical-grammatical resources, the systems of choice that give meaning to a text. What are these systems? Transitivity, logic. There are, of course, other systems related to the use of modality, the use of tense,